everybody. I'm Michelle. I'm co-founder and CEO of Supercritical. Just a little background to myself. I'm a second-time founder. So previously I started a company called Songkick, which was a mobile app we raised from Y Combinator, Index, and Sequoia, and I exited that business to Warner Music in 2017. I came to the climate crisis quite late. After leaving Songkick, I decided, oh my God, climate, this is a thing. I need to do something about it. And after building a mobile app that 20 million people used monthly, I didn't quite know what I could do about the climate fight, and I decided I need to take a lot of time to learn and figure it out. So I then joined Local Globe, which is a seed stage VC fund here in London, to start making investments in climate tech companies and meet smart people, academics, activists, to really understand where do I feel like I can have the biggest impact. But the real inspiration for Supercritical came when I had my first child in 2018, and a month after he was born, the IPCC report about getting to net zero by 2050 came out. And I remember thinking, you're going to be 32 years old in 2050. That's not very long from now. I don't feel like we're going to reach this target, and it's really, really scary to me. And it got me really obsessed with the science of what does it mean to reach net zero? What are the decarbonization pathways? But more critically, what is this footnote in the IPCC report that talks about carbon removal? Ooh, the slides are not moving forward. Can somebody, this is not in sync with the monitor, unfortunately. Sorry, guys. There we go. One more. I don't think this is, there we go, okay. So, while of course we have to focus on reduction and decarbonizing, there is no net zero scenario without carbon removal. This is what the science says. And I don't feel that this is discussed kind of publicly enough in terms of what carbon removal is. These are technologies that actively absorb carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and sequester it for a period of time. These are things from tree planting, which we're all familiar with, all the way up to very novel technologies like direct air capture, enhanced rock weathering, biochar, ocean alkalinity enhancement, and many, many more that haven't been invented yet. But according to the science, we'll need a portfolio of these pathways in order to reach net zero emissions by 2050 and stay below 1.5 degrees of warming. The science also says that by 2050, we'll have to remove 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide annually from the atmosphere. That's from a standing start of 700,000 tons. We are desperately off track. So these permanent carbon dioxide technologies so far have removed 700,000 tons. We need to get to 10 billion in a few decades. So to date, we've removed about 0.05% of what we'll need annually by 2050. This, to me, is an urgent kind of scaling challenge that collectively, as businesses that have committed to net zero, we need to mobilize on and start acting on today. I believe that the Science Based Targets Initiative has unfortunately led us down a track of leaving carbon removal to later. Because they've rightly focused on the reduction that every company needs to focus on, they've implied a linear pathway between reduction and removal. So their guidance says you must reduce down to the last 10% of your residual emissions, and at that point, buy permanent carbon removal for that remaining 10%, and at that point, you've reached net zero, which implies a sequential pathway, right, where you reduce, then in 2050 you buy carbon removal, and you get to net zero. But unfortunately, this doesn't follow the science of scaling carbon removal. What is good about their guidance is they are very clear that every business that has made a net zero commitment is required to engage with permanent carbon removal at some point in order to declare net zero. So every company of yours that has made a net zero commitment will at some point need to buy permanent carbon removal. But how is this science failing us? Well, it's clear that in order to scale to gigaton capacity, we need to engage and start buying carbon removal today. The Oxford University came out with a study on the state of carbon dioxide removal late last year, and they've made it very, very clear that in order to get to this gigaton capacity we need, we must start deploying carbon removal in the next 10 years. So we have a very short window to start deploying, scaling these technologies in order to reach 10 billion tons by 2050. So that means that every single company that has made a net zero commitment must start deploying and engaging with carbon removal today if they want the capacity available by 2050. And I feel like this is where SBTI really fails us on not being science-based in their guidance around how we should think about carbon removal as corporates. Nearly 8,000 companies have made a commitment to SBTI. These are all businesses that have said publicly, I'm going to reach net zero by 2030, 2040, 2050. And yet there have only been 300 buyers of permanent carbon removal. So there's this incredible gap between those commitments and action today. And we need these 7,000 plus companies to start buying and engaging with carbon removal today in order to build the capacity of carbon removal that we'll need in the future. Remember, we're at 700,000 tons. We need to get to 10 billion tons. In the absence of good guidance from SBTI on how to think about removals in parallel with reductions, most corporates we work with are following the Oxford offsetting principles that have very great, clear guidance around how to think about permanent carbon removals in your overall offsetting strategy. Recently, they came out with updated guidance in the last couple of weeks that very much reinforces this message. They very much made it clear that if you're following their guidelines, if you're going to be net zero aligned in your offsetting strategy, you must start buying carbon removal today. They've kind of explained a parallel pathway of reduction and removals happening at the same time. So they've made it really clear that we must do both at the same time. We can't wait and defer until a later date to buy carbon removal. What they've said in their updated guidance is that actors should not wait until just a few years before their net zero target and assume that the solutions they will need to counterbalance the residual emissions will be available. So this is the twin pathway that corporates who are following the Oxford offsetting principles are engaging with right now. So it's buying a little bit and then increasing that share over time until your permanent removals share matches your residual emissions at your net zero end date. This dual pathway of reducing and removing at the same time can get us from 700,000 tons today to 10 billion tons by 2050. I want to be really clear, this is a daunting scaling challenge. I don't think there's any technology in the history of mankind that has scaled this quickly. It's 14,000x growth over the next 26 years, but we won't reach our target of net zero and stay below 1.5 degrees of warming if we don't invest in carbon removal capacity today. So what are these 300 odd buyers of permanent carbon removal doing? Why are they doing it? We're lucky enough at Supercritical to work with 1/3 of these buyers. So we're very familiar with their reasoning, how they get stakeholder buy-in from their corporates, how they pass the budget with their CFO. And there are 3 main reasons why companies start buying today. The first one is pretty straightforward. It's to actually have climate impact, to clean up the garbage you're putting into the atmosphere. One of our company's businesses is Tide, which is a business bank here in the UK. They're in the lucky position of being able to afford to offset 100% of their emissions with permanent carbon removal, and they've made that commitment from 2023 going forward. And their rationale is quite straightforward. As a business bank, they have low revenue intensity. There's not much they can do to decarbonize other than limit their business travel. And so the best use of their climate budget is to actually clean up what they're putting out there in the atmosphere. Their rationale is every ton of carbon I emit warms the planet for millennia. I'm going to do what I can to take that out and have a net zero impact on the climate. Not everyone can afford to do this, of course, but this is kind of what I believe ambitious climate action looks like. The second reason is to make the market we require in the future. So one of the first early buyers of carbon removal is Shopify. They're one of our investors, and their argument is most of their emissions are in scope 3. They're not a heavy emitting industry like steel with a factory or cement. So the best use of their budget is to catalyze the industry to get to this gigaton scale. That's how they want to use their climate budget. And they believe that sending this demand signal to the supply side will help the supply side scale, because basically deployment comes from people buying the carbon removal offsets, and that is how we'll get to the gigaton scale we need. So the second reason is really a bit, I guess, about impact in the macro sense of we want to help scale carbon removal, so we're going to send a demand signal and start buying these offsets for our company today. The third reason is maybe a bit more economically rational. So this is a graph analysis that BCG did very recently around the rapid supply and demand mismatch we'll have in permanent carbon removal. So the bar graphs are the intended built capacity for carbon removal, and the green line is the expected demand in these offsets. And there's a wild mismatch. And so forward-thinking CEOs are seeing that future and knowing, I've made a net zero commitment, I will require these tons in the future, I need to lock in the supply today, I need to sign offtakes and commit to these suppliers so I guarantee access to the carbon removal offsets I will need in the future to comply with my stated net zero goals. They are doing this in the form of offtakes, which is an advanced market commitment in a sense where you are saying to a supplier, I promise to buy your capacity in the future in the next 5 years, let's say 2025 through 2030, and I'm locking in a stable price per ton that's not going to be prone to the wild fluctuations in this supply-demand mismatch, so I can budget and forecast, and I know then I'm guaranteed these offsets in 2030 when I'll need them when I say I'm getting to net zero. So we're seeing a lot of CEOs look in the future and realize they'll need this and start engaging with the suppliers today to lock in that capacity and get in those agreements. We are one of the world's leading carbon removal marketplaces. As I said, we're lucky to be working with 1/3 of the permanent carbon removal buyers. And these are the insights we've learned from our buyers. But a lot of people come to us and say, I know I need to do this. I'm lost. How do I get started? What is carbon removal? How do I think about it? How do I think about budget? How is it different from conventional offsets that I've been buying for the last 10 years? And we have a few simple questions we ask to help companies take action. So the first three are interrelated. The first one, they kind of affect each other. But the main question to ask yourself is, what percentage of your emissions do you want to remove? How many tons do you want to remove? And that's kind of an internal narrative you have to build to get your stakeholders and communicate to the public around, for example, is it my business travel that I want to offset? Did I do an office refit recently that I want to offset with permanent carbon removal? Is it my scope 1 and 2 emissions while I'm switching to renewables that I want to offset? But that tonnage amount will determine what you can afford, right? Then the second one is setting a budget for permanent carbon removal, and this is probably the trickiest question to ask yourselves, the trickiest conversation to have with your C-suite and your CFO. And there are a few benchmarks that people use. One is setting internal carbon tax on your emissions, an internal carbon price, and some guidance that our customers follow are either following the social cost of carbon, which is a Nobel Prize-winning analysis of how much does it cost society to emit a ton of carbon, which is about 150 pounds per ton. Some people follow the EU ETS cost, which is about 80 pounds per ton. Probably the most aggressive pricing that we've heard of is following the UK's marginal abatement cost curve, which is about 250 pounds per ton. But whatever it is for yourself internally, you want to set a budget for carbon removal. Some people do it by a share of their revenue, like 0.2% of your revenue, but this is an internal conversation you need to have with your CFO. These two factors will then establish what price per ton you can afford, right? So that will then tell you what portfolio of carbon removal offsets you can purchase. The average price per ton will then tell you what's the range of offsets you can afford. And the reason why this is important is because these technologies are very early and expensive, and the prices range quite wildly. A ton of afforestation is about 35 pounds per ton, but the challenge with that is that the carbon is not stored permanently, and then direct air capture can be about 500 pounds a ton, and there are price points in between. So blending a portfolio of solutions to suit your average price per ton will help you kind of figure out what works for you and your company. Then you need to understand your risk and quality criteria. So of course, we know what the ICVCM say, every registry, permanence, additionality, et cetera, but there's a lot of nuance in those terms. So knowing what does permanence mean for you? Is it centuries? Is it millennia? What does additionality mean to you? Are you looking at financial additionality as well as climate additionality. These are all quite nuanced questions, and you need to understand how do these factors trade off against each other as you're coming to procure carbon removal. Then defining for your company and your culture what co-benefits matter. For a lot of businesses, the location of the project matters because there might be an office they have in India, or they have a big market in sub-Saharan Africa, so they want to have a project that aligns with that story. And once you've done that, you can start to look at the market, understand what suppliers are out there, and construct your portfolio. And once you've done that, knowing what commercial structure you want to take, whether that's buying on the spot market just to get started this year, or signing a long-term offtake agreement to lock in a relationship with a supplier and get price stability, these are all questions you have to ask yourself. But I would say that these are the core 6 ones that will help you develop your carbon removal strategy and get started today. But I think the main message is don't wait till tomorrow. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Just buy a little bit so you engage, you understand the nuances, the risk involved, you get familiar with the technologies and get to know suppliers. If any of you are interested in this topic, we are hosting a small breakfast with sustainability leaders where both BCG and Tide will share their experiences of setting carbon removal budget, and we have a few spaces available, so please find me afterwards or speak to my team. We have a stand in the corner in B3, and we can sign you up for the breakfast, and it's in a couple of weeks' time, so we'd love to have you there. These are, I guess, the thing that we've learned over the last couple of years is there is no established best practice. Everyone is feeling their way through this nascent market. There's no kind of perfect answer. People are trying things out, and we have to be willing to make mistakes and experiment in order to start scaling the industry. We can't wait till guidance from SBTI comes out and we just tick the boxes and follow it. We have to start doing it today. I guess if I could leave you with any message, there is no net zero without carbon removal, but there will be no carbon removal if we don't act today. So please reach out. This is my email. I'm happy to hear your feedback and kind of answer your questions, because this is something that is kind of a collective problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Some powerful messages there at the end. Happy to take questions from the room, and we'll look at questions online as well. We have a mic that can come round. Any immediate questions from the room? Just at the back, thank you.
There's a lot of focus on carbon removal and pricing. I mean, I work in a different market, I understand that. But what about actually making the substantial difference and making sure we don't emit, or we get to a net zero plus focus from these businesses? Because we're all focused on, as I said, let's get the offsets, let's get all of those things done. But really, actually, the difference is why emit? How can you stop that?
Absolutely.
That's the long-term strategy. That's the short-term strategy is patch it. The long-term strategy is how can you make the real difference?
I don't see it as a short-term patching strategy. I think the point is we have to do both at the same time.
Yeah.
We've left it so late that if we just focus on reduction and then think magically there'll be 10 billion tons there in 2050, we'll be screwed.
Yeah, I agree.
So we have to do both. While there is definitely a focus and priority on reduction, we can't leave it till later to start scaling these carbon technologies.
And when I say short-term, I mean maybe a couple of decades. But really what you need is a fundamental change in the way you do things.
Yeah.
From a circular economy point of view, and what we haven't touched yet, and no one has touched, is scope 4. What happens to that product when it's gone in the market in 10 years' time?
Yeah.
Is it going to end up in landfill? Is it going to end up wherever?
Yeah. I think the challenge is maybe 30 years ago we could have focused on reduction first, and carbon removal would be a sci-fi kind of solution, but we just have left it too late. We have to do both of them.
Yeah, and what I'm trying to say is don't lose sight of the long term.
Yeah.
Okay, any further questions? Oh, right next, and then we'll come across to the front here. Thank you.
I wanted to ask about the projects that Supercritical does. You talked a lot about the market, but not about what the removals are. I was looking at your website, and there's a lot of projects on biochar, bio-oil, using agricultural waste. You talk about reaching scale and efficiencies. If you're not at the scale now, how do you feed those reactors? How do you certify that it's waste, and how do you account for the embedded emissions of the production of the waste?
Great question. So we have a climate science team that vets every project we onboard onto our platform. So on top of being on a registry and an MRV provider, we do additional due diligence, because that LCA analysis of is it actually net negative, including the embodied emissions of transport and what's in the, in the production of that biomass is incredibly important to have actual climate impact. So we do look at that on a project by project basis. And as you mentioned, we do offer a range of technologies and methods from afforestation to biochar to enhanced rock weathering. And that's very much because we believe, well, it's not what we believe. The science says that no single removal pathway can get to 10 billion ton scale. So we need a portfolio of methods to do 2 billion, 3 billion, 500 million to get to the 10 billion ton scale we need by 2050. So that's the approach we've taken at Supercritical, and what our buyers kind of get from our platform is the additional vetting and the confidence that this is a real ton of carbon removed. I won't be in the headline of The Guardian if I buy this ton of carbon, and I have confidence in my procurement.
Okay, next question is just down at the front here to my right. The mic is coming around.
Hello, good morning. I have a question because on one of the slides you shared that there are 7,000 plus companies who set targets with the SBTi, while only 700,000 tons of CDRs have been purchased so far. What's, from your perspective, the reason for this inactivity, and how can we make it work? So what can, for example, sustainability managers in the companies do to win over hearts and minds of the board to invest in this?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. I believe that, as I mentioned before, most of us are following SBTi, and they are the gold standard for net zero, and they've done a disservice to the science of how we reach net zero and scaling carbon removal by kind of punting the carbon removal guidance to the BVCM, right, and thinking, deal with that beyond value chain. I'm not going to help you set an interim target for carbon removal. And so in the absence of that, of SBTi coming up with that robust guidance that you can all follow, we believe the Oxford offsetting principles, or we've seen that corporates are following the Oxford offsetting principles, which is very clear around engage with carbon removal today. And the argument really is those three that I mentioned. It's either you will need it to hit net zero, and if you don't start engaging with suppliers today, you won't have the supply you need to reach net zero. It's kind of the rational commitment that you've made to net zero, and how many tons will you, what's your 10% residual emissions? If you need that in 2050, you need to lock that in now and start engaging with the suppliers now, because that supply and demand mismatch means you'll be left in the dust in 2-3 years' time if you don't start doing it today. I think that's the strongest argument for your board and your C-suite. But then there is the climate argument of we have to start building the capacity today. If you've made a net zero commitment, engaging with permanent carbon removal must happen right now. It can't be deferred for a few years' time.
Okay, we'll take one more question from the room just at the front here. Just wait.
I think the SBTi, I think the SBTi last week has come out with the BVCM guidance,
Yes, they have.
which is actually really great. You know, it's basically giving guidance that for best practice, you should offset at least a minimum of 50% of scope 1, 2, and 3.
Yes, they did do that. You're absolutely right, which is great. I don't think they're moving fast enough for them to mobilize action among buyers. And the other criticism I have is they don't make a distinction, BVCM, between removals and avoidance and other kind of climate impact activities like lobbying or paying for activism. And I believe that for the science of net zero, we need specific carbon removal guidance. We need corporates to understand how carbon removal is a distinct activity from beyond value chain mitigation. It is part of your part of your net zero strategy is engaging with carbon removal for your residual 10% of emissions. But yeah, I'm so happy that they came out with that. It was like a great week where both Oxford offsetting principles updated the guidance and SBT came out with updated guidance as well.
Okay, and our final question will come from our digital audience. We've, of course, got thousands of people joining us digitally today as virtual delegates. This one is from John Currian. How can businesses effectively transition to a net zero carbon emissions model? And I think we'll class that as a $1 billion question.
How can they effectively
transition to a net zero carbon emissions model?
Yeah, well, I think it's the dual pathways of reducing and removing at the same time. Definitely focusing more on reduction, but starting to engage with carbon removal and growing the share of your emissions that you remove over time until you reach net zero and they balance each other out.
Okay,
Yeah.
Michelle, thank you very much indeed. Thank you
Thank
very much.
We have a
questions.
stand, so come speak to us afterwards.